Here are some lessons from a 2-year-old syntropic agroforestry that I installed, and it was between existing mandarins. So this was installed as 3 lines, 60 meters each, and there's a few different dynamics that I want to talk about. One is the pioneers, right, the support species, and how it's really an emergent and high strata dominant system. What that means, what the next steps are, where it's been successful and where it hasn't been. We'll dive into that. I also want to dive into some of the seeded things, right? The fruit trees that we planted from grafted trees, fruit trees that we planted from seeds, and how those dynamics are doing, what's working, what's not working so well. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is what the main takeaways of the system are at this stage, 2 years in. So this is a system that was planted where I really doubled down on the support species that were working well. Especially you'll see a lot of right now, tree lucerne and the eucalyptus. So yes, diversity is important, but at the same time, finding winners, right? Finding your local winners from your weedscape, the trees, the support trees that work really well, grow fast in your area. Once you find those, just double, triple, and quadruple down. And so that's what this is an example of, which is why it probably also just kind of looks like, if you look through, a forest of tree lucerne and eucalyptus and some other stuff underneath. Basically what it is, it's a monoculture of eucalyptus, and you can see after 2 years, the diameter is about a hand. Right? The tree lucerne, which is also a lot of what you're seeing, they're in flower at the moment. And so, yes, a lot of senescence, right? Stagnant influence in the system. However, because it's still providing a service, right? We're still threatened by frost. It's late winter, kind of almost early spring. You'll see some things starting to grow. I don't want to open things up all the way just yet because I did this last year or 2 years ago in September. I thought we were okay, opened things up, smashed by frost. And so I'm going to wait until early to mid-October, another couple weeks, and we're going to actually prune this as part of a big training we have coming up here on the farm, October 2nd through the 7th if you're in New Zealand and interested. Big hands-on training, and this is one of the systems that we'll be managing, and we'll be looking at how do you actually manage and prune these tree lucerne, the eucalypts, the Mexican sunflower, all these species to accelerate the development of our fruit trees in the understory, which we'll take a look at. Here's what's important. One of the key lessons and things that's worked really well and also hasn't about that part of the system, the support species. When I say you want an emergent and high strata dominant system, sometimes you'll see diagrams of agroforestry saying you only want 20% of emergent trees at the top, 40% of high strata, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't account for the support species. That's for your target crop. So for example, the cropping nuts, fruits, timber, etc. Right? When it comes to support trees, I actually want, and I've planted a monoculture, almost, a biculture, polyculture, of basically just tree lucerne and eucalypts at a high density, right? The tree lucerne are every 1.5 meters, and the eucalypts are meant to be every 1.5 meters as well. By most standards, that's quite dense. And the reason for that is because that's where the microclimate comes from. Not by having what I tried in the first year was an isolated eucalypt here, an isolated tree lucerne here. And so once you see the dynamics of and the power of the microclimate, how much organic material it generates, how much leaf litter it generates, which we'll dive into and see, you start to double down. And so that's why I've planted them so densely. And even this year, the systems that we're going to be planting, even more dense than this one. Keep that in mind. And so at the moment, the areas that are doing the best here, the areas where there's the least grass pressure, there's the most leaf litter, there's the healthiest fruit tree development, the fastest fruit tree development from grafted and seed, is where I have a really good high and emergent dominant canopy, right? And what I mean by that is basically, if you look across the high strata, right, for here is the acacia, the tree lucerne, it's full, right? There's not huge gaps in this area. Now, if we go down that way, there are a couple gaps, and that's actually where you see things are starting to struggle more because there's more grass pressure, and the fruit trees and the seeded trees are growing slower, where there's a gap missing in the high and emergent canopy layers. And so that's why it's so important when you're planting your pioneer species, your accumulation system, your global planting, to go through and plant a really high density of your high and emergent species. Usually these are the ones that love the sun, which is why they're high emergent, right? A full canopy. And what you're going to do, what we'll be doing in a couple weeks, is coming through with the secateurs, with the loppers, with the saws, and radically cutting all this organic material down, putting it on the ground, and that's going to pull all of our other fruit trees up into the canopy. We're going to transition to an edible ecosystem rather than just leaving it. Of course, if we just left this, if we were hands off, yes, all the fruit trees underneath, they would grow. But would they grow as fast? Would they be as productive? Would they be as healthy? Absolutely not. And we could speed it up with our pruning. And we've also got poplar in here, which at the moment, year 2, they're still not massive. They were only planted as small cuttings. And so if you want faster poplar, we're going to do an example of this year. You can actually plant branches this big, quite large, and immediately have them in that high emergent canopy layer. That's great. Here, we started with small cuttings. In the new system, we'll start with poles. If we just back this way, this is a really good example. Here's a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about when I say emergent dominant, right? If you just look at the emergent strata, the emergent canopy layer all the way at the top, it's pretty much like, I would say 90% occupied by the eucalypts. Obviously there's a gap here, right below that there's the tree lucerne and the high strata, but it's pretty full eucalypt. There's actually an acacia trying its best. It'll get some space and some love and some sunlight when we prune the eucs. And before long, I'm gonna start actually thinning the eucalypts out. I might not even keep this density during this intervention. We might actually selectively thin some of the eucalypts already down and out of the system, and that's great. Some people think, oh, but I don't want big eucalypts in my system, especially at that density. You don't keep them there. You cycle them in, and even if I cycled these 2-year-old eucalypts in, they're still providing a service. Those roots are gonna start decomposing, creating root tunnels, and feeding the trees around them. So it's not a waste, it's a service to overplant. And because they're also cheap trees. You can buy eucalypts here in for $1.50, $2.50 in New Zealand. So overplant them to give yourself that allowance. And so right now, this might look like a weedy jungle, not even a food forest. But if you look at your eyes and see the accumulation of organic material, of life that's happening here, and in the understory, right? A beautiful example right here. These loquats are planted from seed. Some of them are growing faster than others. We've got an avocado right there planted from seed, another avocado, another 3 avocados made it right here. This was also planted as part of a training, and so there's a little bit of inconsistencies around. But with this next reset, all these trees are going to elevate and reach for the sunlight. At the moment, we're coming out of winter. Things have been stagnant. You can see that. The frosty banana, it still has some green, right? Which means that the microclimate's working. It's doing its job. It's protecting from absolutely just getting cooked. Now, in some of the areas where the tree lucerne and the eucalypts are less dense, the bananas look more fried. So building that microclimate, super important. I went to a friend's house last weekend. We planted a food forest 3 years ago at his place, and I talked about adding some more loquats in from seed because I had some, and he was really afraid of planting the loquats because he's familiar with them as being these really big trees, just being overbearing. And me personally, I'm not afraid of loquats. I'm not afraid of any tree because you can always cut a tree down. And when I have loquat planted here, and there's one coming up here and over there, you plant them in such a high density, of course you're not going to leave them all to grow. But in the meantime, before you start cycling them out, before you start aggressively pruning, they're already shedding their leaves, right? And so, for example, it's early spring, right? Fresh, new, soft growth in the loquat. Here's the end of last season's growth. Nice, dark green, rigid, big leaves. It's starting to pull some nutrients back to shed the leaves. Here's another example of that. And if you keep looking at the soil underneath, right, you can see another one that's recently fallen, one that's starting to decompose a little bit more. And if we come really close, you'll actually see these loquat leaves are turning into soil right here, creating really nice conditions for a longer term fruit tree, which at this point right here is a cherimoya. And so it's not that we're going to leave all these seeded trees in forever. Of course not. We're going to prune, but we're giving ourselves the opportunity to do this, to build soil, not just on the surface, that's what we can see, but there's also root exudates, right? Liquid carbon being pumped into the soil, the biology, the microbes, all the sugars that are being fed to the microbes from the photosynthesis here. It's a whole ecosystem. And rather than spot planting an individual tree and maybe just dumping mulch, this is such a different paradigm. It's such a different approach to creating a resilient, natural fertility-based ecology that's also edible. And so one of the things that I'm really impressed by, of course, is the loquats, for example, and the cherimoya that have been planting from seed, and the avocados. We've got some nice pepino right here. The bananas, for 2 years, this area, they're really struggling, right? They don't get enough water here. They got absolutely smashed by the frost the previous year, and they're not as fast producers as they are in the tropics, for example, or even in the true subtropics. We're not in the proper subtropics here. Everything in the subtropical zone is kind of a push for us. And so at this stage, I'm not even taking these leaves off because, yes, I could come through and I could keep everything really tidy, but actually leaving these leaves, even though they're dead and cooked, they're still providing more of a microclimate. So I'm not taking them off until we do the reset in about 2 weeks. So this video is mostly just for me, for reference, so I can remember what it looks like at this stage. For the folks in the fellowship who are curious and kind of asking about this, but also anyone on YouTube who's curious about some of the details of this system that was installed 2 years ago and some of the dynamics that are at play. I mentioned that this area was planted in and amongst some struggling mandarin trees. there was a lot of disease pressure. These were some of the trees that the previous owner had fully just neglected, abandoned. They were getting crawled over with grass, and they've since then greened up quite a lot, right? They're a lot healthier. You can see this one's still got a bunch of mandarins on it. And so the strategy was, and the challenge with planting in and amongst established fruit trees is real. Couldn't get the tractor in to do a subsoiler or to get a big implement in to prepare these lines because there's trees in the way, obviously. But also it depends on how heavily can you reset these trees, right? Because they're producing trees and it's hard to do a full heavy reset on these trees that are already productive. And so what I've done is basically from the drip line of the existing mandarins, I would go out maybe 30 centimeters, half a meter, and plant a eucalyptus on the border, right? And so in my mind, this is kind of the access point to either be able to walk through, to harvest from the sides of the mandarins, and ideally, all of our tree lines that we're planting aggressively from seed happen basically between these two eucalypts on the end of each section between those existing mandarins. Now, obviously, there's some exceptions. We've got some loquats that have come up here. There's a redwood that got planted. That's one of the longer-term trees here. And so, of course, there are exceptions, but that's generally the rule and the guidance that I'm practicing by here is eucalypt posts on the edges, just outside of the drip line of the mandarins, and everything else super dense in between those. And you can see what that looks like. In between the eucalypts, we've got tree lucerne, pepino, sugarcane, cherimoya, banana, loquat. This is a mulberry, more loquats, cherry guava, cherimoya, pepino, avocados, macadamias, citrus. And it's all planted in here. And the reason it works at this density is because they're all different. And I'm sure you've heard this I'm sure you've heard this before from me, but it's because they're in different strata, occupying different canopy layers and different life cycles. And so I'm not expecting that, for example, the cherry guava is going to be a super productive species for 30 years. That's not my intention because, truthfully, you can grow one of these from seed and have it producing within 2 years. And so I'm not going to try and maximize for the cherry guava. If I need to take the cherry guava out to replace it with, for example, the cherimoya, it's a higher value fruit. So I'm going to make that trade every day of the week. And so that's how I think about species succession. I'm not going to try and keep sugarcane here for 10 years. No. But in the meantime, it's putting lots of sugars in the soil, it's creating lots of organic material, it's creating a nice microclimate, and I'll harvest sugarcane for the number of years, and then by the time it's ready to be moved out, whatever's next, whether it's the loquat, whether it's the mulberry, the cherimoya next to it, the avocado, it'll take its place, and that's a higher succession fruit. I'm always trading upwards. This is interesting. So one of the interesting things that's happening here that's different to all the other systems on the land that we planted so far is that once I've prepared the lines, we've got a support species or an invasive weedy pest tree that's germinating inside the tree lines pretty aggressively. It's called privet. You might know of it if you're in New Zealand. Now, I don't plant this stuff at all, but clearly it's either A, in the soil bank, or B, being shat out by birds. And so I'm not actually pulling this out. And the reason is, it's a tree that grows voluntarily here. It's the ecology is saying, yes, privet can thrive here. And so I'll just leave these and see. If they turn into a big tree, I'll learn how to manage them and include them in the system and use them to transition the landscape to a healthier ecology, right, to a more productive one. There's this great saying that I think it was Felipe Passini in Italy, basically that nature plants indiscriminately, right? There's no discrimination with what gets planted. And so why would I take this and say, it's not from here, it's invasive, I'm going to rip it out? Well, clearly it might have the opportunity at one stage to provide some function. At the moment, the tree lucerne, I selected this. It's obviously not from here either. It's from Tenerife or the Canary Islands. It's doing a phenomenal job, but it's not going to last forever. It's probably not even going to last 10 years. But maybe this, right, or the eucalypt, or the redwood, or the poplar, or whatever other native species or longer-lived timber trees, the acacia, are in here, they might contribute to building that ecology and the microclimate long-term. One thing that's also really cool about this area is when it was planted, we inoculated it with King Stropharia. It's a mushroom. It's a garden giant. It makes these mushrooms about like a dinner plate size. And so when the conditions are right throughout the year, we get these beautiful flushes across all the lines of these giant dinner plate sized mushrooms. They're edible. It's amazing. And that just is dependent on continually feeding organic material, which is what we'll do in the next coming weeks. Now, the nice thing about this and using these tree lucerne is it has these really nice white pretty flowers at this time of year. And so when you do a spring pruning, the mulch is just like this incredible beautiful white flower mulch. It's more beautiful than anything you could buy at the garden center in a bag of mulch, that's for sure. And just more ecological process right? I prune about 95% of the foliage off of these, and so we will film some demos and some trainings on how we actually go about doing that, the decision making around it. But all of these observations that I'm making here, right, we're spending today kind of starting to weed the tree lines, take some of the grasses out, the kikuyu, which, to be honest, these lines have done really well at not having a ton of weed pressure because of that emergent and high strata dominant system. Whereas in some of the gaps where the tree lucerne and the eucalypts are missing, a lot more grass pressure, a lot more stunted trees. So, in saying that, these observations that we're making right now, as you're going through the tree line, weeding, it sounds like a pain in the ass kind of job. It kind of is, but at the same time, it's the way you can get the most intimate with your system. You can make the most observations about your system. And so that's such a key and crucial part of the process. It might seem like a chore, it might seem like a headache, but it's such a great place to make observations because those observations are what are going to inform how you go about managing things during the intervention. You always want to do your selective weeding before you prune, because otherwise, if I didn't say, for example, take the grass pressure out of the tree lines, and I just started feeding not only just organic material and fertility, but also sunlight, right? If I start burying these weeds that I don't want in the tree lines, like mostly it's the vining grasses, the things that are going to pull other fruit trees down. Most other things, I'm happy to leave. But I don't want to feed those. I don't want to feed them with organic material and fertility, and I certainly don't want to feed them with the extra sunshine and the sunlight that's going to come in and flood once we do this pruning. And so doing the weeding, it's great because you're not feeding the weeds when you do your reset, but also you're taking the time to make the observations and see what are the dynamics, right? Where does this mulberry want to sit in relation to the guava, in relation to these avocado seedlings, to the pomegranate, to this highland papaya, which will regrow leaves, to the citrus. It's kind of the more slow part of agroforestry. Obviously, we can make really cool montages of pruning and chainsaws, but a lot of the work in agroforestry is also really slow and deliberate and observation-based. And don't skip that. So right here, there's two really cool examples of a species combo that I'm loving at the moment. It's firstly the Araucaria augustifolia. This is the Paraná nut. I brought back some seeds from Brazil. It's native to South Brazil and Uruguay, and it's a beautiful dinosaur tree. It's a very old tree. A mature tree produces hundreds of kilos of food, beautiful nuts, every year. So that's kind of like the longest term alongside the redwoods that are in these systems, and they're doing phenomenally well. Super spiky. What I'm also really enjoying are these peach seedlings, right? These are peaches from seed from a wild tree down the coast, right, towards Takaha. I brought back maybe 25 seeds. That was it. I scrounged around the ground of the tree, the base, picked up seeds, and the next day I just walked down the line. Every few paces, I would stick one in the ground. And now we have and that was actually a year and a half ago. And so we've got this beautiful little peach tree, and at this stage, I've got multiple other peaches on the land that are flowering right now and producing beautiful peaches from a seed after just 3 years. And so I'm fully expecting that maybe not this year, but the following year, I'm gonna have a ton of really nice peaches in this system. All right, so I'll be making space for those. And long term, we've got the Araucaria augustifolia. We've got a bunch of cherimoya in here that will field graft. We've got our citrus that were either already present or planted some new lemons. Here's an example of that. And so these are the things we're looking for. I'm looking for what's coming up next in succession. What does the management look like? How are we balancing that with the time of year? Obviously, I'm not going to overly prune this time right now because we still might get some frost. Winter is at the end, but it still might happen. So in the next coming months and weeks, you'll see some more updates of this system, what it's going to look like. So just take this as a snapshot in time of post-winter of a 2-year-old system where we've got that kind of diversity. You know, the loquats from seed, avocados from seed, cherimoya, Paraná nut, the Araucaria augustifolia, peaches, loquats, pepino. What else is in here? The mulberries, a lot of those are from cuttings. Sugarcane, papaya. There's macadamias in here as well. And Asimina triloba, the American pawpaw. It's really diverse, and it's an extension of the laboratory. The laboratory keeps expanding, and every year as it expands, it has more and more focus. And so the system this year that I implement is going to have even more focus than this one. It might still have the same kind of diversity, but it's going to be even more structured. I'm going to have more grafted fruit trees spaced at a very particular way, so you'll see more of that as well. But it's always nice to just take that time, go slow, observe what you've done in the past. The great expression is that it's a museum of errors. It's a museum of mistakes. And you can learn from those mistakes. I've made tons of mistakes in here, but I've also made tons of learnings and lessons out of those. And they're going to keep coming. I'm going to find new lessons this year with this system and next year and the year following. And all of that's just going to inform how you plant in the present. So every single year, you should be planting agroforestry. Every year. Because you're learning from your previous mistakes. and that's how you do it. Now I'm getting a phone call. I gotta run. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Click the link here to see whatever video is next, and I'll see you there.